Hello, welcome to the book club. My name is Chris Wenson. I'm your host and the creator of the hashtag 365 Days of Compassion, which the book club is a spin off from. We meet monthly online to chat about a book with the author that has a tie in to compassion and looking after ourselves. This is the first episode of the 2023 season. Hope you enjoy it. There were a few technical issues, so we've had to edit a few bits during the conversation. Hopefully that won't detract from the episode and you'll enjoy it and gain some insight from one of the world's leading expert on bringing compassion to dealing with grief. Here comes the episode. Okay, so welcome to the 365 Days of Compassion book club. It's lovely to be back after actually what's probably nearly 2 years. It wasn't intended to be that long, but there we go. And I'm delighted to have as our guest Darcy Harris. Darcy once wrote, "The experience of grief is perhaps the most poignant of shared human experiences. We all grieve at some point in life. None of us is spared." And I think that's one of those things that attracted me to this as a topic, if you like, for the book club, in terms of it's something that we will all experience. And bringing a compassionate approach to it is something that's probably welcome. And so our guest is Darcy Harris, who's Professor of Thanatology, if I've pronounced that correctly, a psychologist based at the University of Western Ontario. Long career covering, supporting caregivers, cancer care, hospice, and grief counselling. Current research around issues within grief and loss, and non-death loss as well, and grief, supporting caregivers, and particularly on how to bring compassion into care delivery organisations. And the book that Darcy co-edited, I think, was a collection of academic research around the element of bringing that compassion to grief and loss, particularly with a focus around compassion-focused therapy. So, Darcy, it's an absolute privilege and honour to have you as our guest here.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm really happy to be here, delighted. I'll do a correction, because even though there are many academic people writing in the book, almost all of them have clinical practices. And I think when Andy and I put the book together, we asked them to come at it from the space of being a clinician. How do you apply? And the research part was, okay, so how do you know what you're doing and why you're doing it? But really, we wanted to have it be a focus on, how do you actually do this, and what does it mean to actual people who are grieving?
To actually plan it in the real life situation. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So that's actually probably leads on to because what actually inspired bringing that book together in that particular area? What motivated that?
Because of my research in non-death loss, what I was finding, especially with my clients, because I have a clinical practice and I do research, is that people with these non-death losses, they're often ongoing. Like a person who gets diagnosed maybe with Alzheimer's, you as a caregiver, family member, might be looking at 2 years, 10 years, sometimes up to 20 years. It's a long time to be grieving. It's a long time to be adjusting. And I was finding issues with people just exhausted and burned out. And I realized this was their grief, that their grief was being manifest in the anxiety and uncertainty. But I didn't really have a way of addressing how the exhaustion and how people get exhausted in this process. And I was kind of thinking about all this, and I went to a conference actually in Hong Kong and heard Mary Vachon, who's based in Toronto, give a talk about the sustainability of training and compassion for very difficult, intense situations, and how compassion-based focus really helps to sustain people even in really difficult situations. And I thought, aha, I'm interested in this. So my sabbatical year was the next year, and I did a compassion training program at the Upaya Zen Center, did a couple of other compassion trainings, and then found Paul Gilbert and started doing the CFT trainings as well, and just felt, yes, this is what we need for these types of losses. And then I started realizing for the grief that's just so intense for people, we need a way of approaching that allows the grief to unfold, but also gives people a sense of efficacy with their own grief and the ability to sit with their own grief in the way they need to. So I went looking for literature on grief and CFT and didn't find any. So decided to try to put something out there to get things started. So my colleague, Andy Ho, who's based in Singapore, has developed a program there called Mindful Compassion-Based Art Therapy. And the two of us started talking, and we decided we'd put the book together. And we found some amazing people to do contributions to it. It was a lovely experience.
And it's interesting that you mentioned in the collection, if you like, that the key focus you obviously had was to bring out that real world application of it, and how to, because often, you know, research can suggest things, but actually how you apply that in real life settings is the key thing, isn't it?
Exactly. And I see it as a two-pronged, that, you know, the compassion training and compassion focused therapy, you cultivate your stance as a therapist in a compassion-based stance for yourself, and that sustains you. But then you also can utilize various practices that are compassion focused, compassion based with your clients. And so it's almost like the two of you are on a parallel track together, working in this lovely, not bubble, but sustainable place of work together. And it really does give new life to this work. I think I'm really excited by the application of especially CFT, because the compassion training that I didn't really have a lot of application in a therapy context, and CFT really does. And so I thought, wow, this is the gold mine, you know, this is the place to go. And gradually starting to ease it into working with people who are grieving both death and non-death losses.
And now, I suppose that leads on to a question: is within a kind of therapeutic or clinical setting, how's grief perhaps different from other issues that may manifest within that kind of setting?
This is a really important point, because people who have had clinical training were often, I know in my clinical training, we were taught to recognize depression and anxiety and trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. But actual grief is it's not a clinical diagnosis. It's not something you treat. It's the one thing people come in and you're not trying to treat or intervene. You're actually trying to facilitate the healthy part of the grief to unfold. So really to get out of the way. And so it's the one thing where even though people are in pain and they're suffering, and it's very hard and difficult, the goal of grief therapy would not be to relieve that so much as to journey alongside the person as they go through this grieving process. Because really the grief is an adaptive process. There's lots of research about how grief became kind of instinctually programmed into us, but it's something that we need to not rush into rescue or intervene, but really find a way to facilitate the way the grief needs to go for each person, so that it can do the work that it really needs to do. So it's a really different perspective than working with someone who has a clinical diagnosis, or somebody who's having everyday struggles where you're trying to more actively intervene or come up with a plan. Grief is really different in that way.
That's really interesting, because it's just kind of set a thought off in my mind, which is often with CFT or CMT, there can be the fears and barriers and resistance to compassion. I'm just wondering, is that there must be similar within grief as well? So does that compound, or is that kind of interaction between that?
There's a lot. The fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion often come up when people are concerned that they're not functional. You know, when you're really in deep grief, you struggle with, you know, being functional. You struggle with social settings. You're not yourself. there's a lot of social messaging about, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get on with it. And I think that's a very English orientation. We have it here in Ontario, very, very much so. And there's shame that comes with that. There's shame that comes with, not having control of your emotions, or not being as productive or functional. And so I think sometimes when you talk about compassion in these situations, I had one client look at me and say, I'm already wallowing enough in this. I don't need permission to wallow even more. And what I was trying to do was give him a way to gently explore his grief so that it could do what it needed to do, because it kept popping up and he kept pushing it down, because it was in strength to do that, so that eventually he could decide. So I'll just there he is. We noticed we look like you froze, Chris.
I did froze just momentarily, yeah.
I just thought I said something so profound that you just couldn't move. But
no, I was actually, part of what I was hearing though when you were talking about that was, I was actually thinking about something else as well, because one of the other elements I think of CFT and CMT was with the grief work, apart from the fears and barrier resistance, that also strikes me is that CFT focuses, well, not focus, that's not the right word, helps with some pretty intense emotions, which obviously grief is one, but it's, shame, and obviously it's our critical, but particularly shame. And I was interested that you've written, or you've talked a little bit about shame as part within grief.
Mhm.
Could you just explain, because that's not one that I would perhaps, I think when I thought about it, when I heard you talk about where I read it, I thought, yes, it made me, I had to think it through. Would you just mind expanding a bit upon that?
To me, it was one of the more obvious applications of CFT. We tend to not want to display it publicly. You run somebody's house, ask, how are you? And they start to tear up and they start to cry. What's the first thing they're going to say to you? Sorry. They're apologizing. And we're trained that it's not appropriate to show these types of emotions in public, that it's a vulnerability, it's a weakness. And doing it better. Maybe the grief is over a loss that somebody else, what we call disenfranchised, that when the loss itself isn't recognized. Think about the loss of a pet. I was devastated when my cat died a couple of months ago, but I was careful with who I would share how devastated I actually was, because I didn't want to have my grief dismissed, because socially a pet is not the same as losing a person or even a close person. So what we call disenfranchised grief, it's where either the person who's grieving isn't allowed to grieve. Maybe you're the ex-spouse. So, you left that guy. Why are you grieving that he died now? The way you're grieving isn't the way we expect you to grieve. Like if a woman tends to grieve by doing, what we call more instrumentally, or a man tends to grieve through his emotions and his intuition, those break the stereotypes. And these are all forms of disenfranchised grief that can lead to shame. And so shame is a huge undercurrent to the grieving process. And I think in working with people from a compassionate base, then it opens it up that we can start to just have quotes from some of my clients, and I do reframe some of the quotes. Like I told you, the guy who said, I've got to stop wallowing in this. And what's wrong with you? His principal, he was a teacher at a school, and his principal kept calling and asking when he was coming back to work, and it made him feel bad and feel like I should just be bucking up here and getting on with it. So I hope that kind of makes some sense. But I find this area, and I know I've talked with a couple people who are really engaged with CFT, and we've talked about shame and the approach of compassion towards shame. And we're all on the same page, that if we can kind of put a light on what the shame is actually usually from unrealistic social expectations, instead of of some flaw in the person, it really is a relief, I think, for people to say, oh, okay, there's not something wrong with me. I live in a place that doesn't allow me to be the way I need to be right now.
Which I guess also has a link in with that the element of self-criticism as well, and that negative thinking that often, which I guess could come with grief in terms of maybe I'm not expressing grief correctly, or I'm not feeling the grief enough, or it must open the door as well to that real intense kind of self-criticism as well.
Absolutely. And when I'm with clients, I'm listening for this language, and not because I want to confront, but because I want to gently open the door to maybe there's another way to be with this that will allow you to do what you need to do, and take away at least the burden of the shame and the self-criticism that's coming in. You don't need that on top of everything else that you're already dealing with. You know, the loss is enough to be dealing with on top of everything else.
It's a very fascinating area actually, that around the links between those kind of key emotions around shame and linking to grief.
I don't know if you're familiar with social pain theory, and there's some controversy around it, but social pain theory really posits that that we experience the pain of rejection and the pain of not belonging actually along the same neural pathways that we experience physical pain. We have a visceral response when people reject us or judge us, or when we're excluded.
Right.
And so what I find with some of my grieving clients is they will accommodate their grief. They will mold it and do what they need to do in order to not have another loss of being rejected, or having somebody not be comfortable to be around them. So they may really be in deep, really a dark place, but they often will not say so because they don't want to make you uncomfortable, because they can't afford another loss, or they can't afford you to reject them or to walk away because they're already dealing with such a wound in their attachment system. So you'll see people go through all kinds of convolutions in their grief to try to keep this from happening as well. And I don't think it serves us very well at all.
No, and I guess one of the key parts with CFT, or one of the bits that I welcomed within CFT, is the idea of the compassionate self. So different to self-compassion, the compassionate self, and for me, it always has a couple of different. I wish I could think of the right word, attributes. So kind of courage and wisdom. And it's really struck me a few times in what you've been talking about when you're working with folks who are grieving. Like the chap you said, you didn't want to wallow in it. I guess bringing that compassionate self, bringing that compassionate courage and wisdom are real key tools to aid them.
Absolutely. I do find sometimes identifying the compassionate self to be tricky. It takes energy for people to kind of do that. I was working with a client actually just this earlier today, and I could see where she really needed to have some openness and to be able to direct some kindness towards her experience. And it was really hard for her. And she could not identify a compassionate self at all. It was too much. So we went to a compassionate other or compassionate being, and she immediately went to her dog. And so we were able to focus on the soothing that she gets from her dog, and what would her dog be thinking about all of this. And she says, my dog just sits there and loves me. And I say, your dog is a very wise dog. And so we were able to use that because she could not in her mind go to a compassionate self. It was just too hard to go there right then, but she could certainly go to the compassion and the soothing that she felt with her dog at the time. I do find that very common with people. I'd be careful too, that if they're going to come up with a compassionate being or compassionate other, that we don't usually name the person who has died, because there's often layers that have not been shared. It could get very complicated. So we might go there later, but we certainly wouldn't start in that place. I find it a lot more accessible to start with a compassionate other or compassionate being, and then to gently go into the compassionate self. And that starts to come together. And then later they may choose to bring their person who died into that space with a compassionate being or with their compassionate self. but I usually don't have them take the person who died as the compassionate being, because it complicates it with the grief. It makes it harder. It raises the grief and sometimes takes away from the soothing part of what we're working toward.
Yeah, I can see that, which is interesting, because I guess you've touched upon, perhaps that's one of the challenging areas. Are there particular challenges with bringing CFT, integrating that with, working with people who are grieving?
When people are really deep in their grief and they're really struggling, I don't usually introduce imagery work. I usually will do body work with them. And, I've had clients who think the 3 circles model is just brilliant. It really helps them. They'll identify where how big the circles are for what they're experiencing. But there's some clients, they just really need to be in their grief. And so my place at that point is to hold the space and to be the compassionate being, is to model compassionately being with this pain, and to model a way of allowing the pain versus trying to suppress it or to question it. And so in that sense, I've become the emotion regulation as part of my own stance as a compassion-based therapist.
And so that prompts another question in my mind then, and it's something I think you did touch upon earlier. To do that as a therapist, as a counsellor, is that where CFT supports you as well in that role?
Well, it's where CMT certainly has supported
CMT,
me.
sorry, yes.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, so CFT is compassion focused therapy. CMT is compassionate mind training. Sometimes I refer to it as compassion training because there are different ways of doing it. I find my own practice, there are times, we all have these moments where we have a client that comes in and you have the oh my God moment, the oh my God, this client is really, and what in the world can I do? And I've learned to take a breath and to sit quietly and wish them well. I essentially wish them, do meditation just for the few seconds I'm sitting in the space with them. And that calms me, helps me to attune, but it also sets up the socio-emotional regulation system with the two of us that's nonverbal. So I immediately, instead of going into my own flooding, because that's very easy to do with people who are really in intense grief, to use it as a form of grounding for myself. And sometimes I will, the most simple thing I do with clients when they're really overwhelmed is I ask them to just rub their hands together and get some energy, and they can feel it. And then we do this together. And I just ask them to breathe into this and to feel the presence of their energy into their chest. That's usually the heart space, is often in grief. My client this morning said it's from here down, but it's very simple, but it's something I do with myself as well.
Yeah, just to kind of ground it, to bring in part of the soothing system. Yeah.
I think a lot of therapists don't really like working with grief, or they find it intimidating, I guess, maybe because you're not trying to make somebody better. The goal of grief therapy isn't to help somebody get better. The goal of grief therapy is to help the grieving process unfold, and the person doesn't do it alone. You're journeying alongside them at a very difficult time. And you're not looking for a Likert scale at the end of the session. Are you feeling better? On a scale of 1 to 5, they'll probably say, no, I'm at about a -5, but somehow it feels okay to be at a -5. You have to really think about, there's nothing you're going to say to someone who's grieving that's going to make them feel better. You can't reverse time. There's no aha that they all of a sudden say, oh, I didn't think about that. They think about it all the time, So what you're modeling in the beginning is a way of being with, heavy duty intensity, emotion regulation through use of soothing of the body. And then often clients will come in and find their own ways. They'll kind of describe things that they've discovered, and we'll start working with that in the sessions as well.
That's a really interesting point, actually, in terms of not having direct goal, as a lot of therapeutic interventions do, and particularly when they're in standard medical kind of care, that there is that, as you said, like it scale at the end. It becomes a tick again. How many ticks can you get on the checklist to go right? Whereas with grief,
we brought you back to this level now, and
yeah,
we ripped the Band-Aid off, and you're not going to feel great right now, but the wound is getting cleansed, and when a wound is cleansed, it finally has the possibility to start to heal, and you have to do that deep. I'm the nurse, my background, but you have to let the deep wound start to heal from the bottom up, because if you just put a Band-Aid over it, it'll abscess. So I think this is the work of grief, that we're not looking to contain, we're not looking to divert, we're looking to learn how to be with this really difficult experience and see what the grief needs to do in order to have your world built back into a place that functions again.
It's fascinating. I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions from anyone. If anyone either wants to come onto the mic, or if they want to type it into the chat, if they want to ask Darcy a question.
I will add too that I've done some thinking about grief and trauma, that I think the 3 circles is really helpful, that obviously grief is a significant loss of whatever that loss is, and I think that trauma and grief are really like this, and the degree to which trauma symptomatology, trauma takes over, is the degree to which the threat system is activated. Because I think in grief, the threat system does get activated as well. You have your drive system where you're seeking proximity to the person. You go to their grave site, you wear their clothes. And to the degree that the threat system gets really activated is really the degree to which you then pay attention to the trauma symptomatology, not to treat symptoms, but to help the person stay grounded, and to really be able to sit with how difficult it is, but also know they're not doing it alone.
Okay. Did I see a hand up a minute ago? I don't know if I did.
I don't know. I've got a quiet group. So,
I'll ask you something. Oh, Rose, was that you waving then, or not?
I was waving, Chris.
You
yes.
were, sorry.
I'm sorry. I wondered if I could just ask Darcy a question or an observation. I was just wondering, with your research around this, whether, having perhaps considered the 2 different groups of carers being male or female, whether you thought that the male carer was more prone to this exaggerated threat feelings because of the fact that the very nature of them being male. In that really taps into their being and their way of being in the caring role.
So I don't necessarily make an assumption when I have not done specific research looking at gender differences, and now I think there's so much diversity in terms of gender orientation, but there are stereotypes still. I would say the grievers that I find the most disenfranchised, that struggle the most with getting the support they need and doing the grief the way they need to do it, men who grieve intuitively or with their feelings, men who need to talk, who need support, because the stereotype is that you're supposed to be strong and you're supposed to be the one to hold it together for everybody else. And there's embarrassment and shame when you're not doing that as a man for a lot of people. I don't find it as much in the younger people as I'm finding it more in people my age, and for women who maybe are not needing to talk about feelings. I did have one client come into me after seeing a psychologist on her EAP plan. She held up a feeling vocabulary. You guys know what that is. It's a list of feeling words that you identify what you're feeling, because she wouldn't talk about her feelings, and that just wasn't her way. So she came in to see me and she held up this feeling vocabulary and she goes, I don't want to do this. This is not going to help me. So she said, people keep thinking I just need to have a good cry. And she said, that's not what I need. And she needed to really question everything. She needed to have things make sense cognitively, and was very disenfranchised because she wasn't emoting. She was actually trying to be rational, and this wasn't an avoidance. This was just who she was. So I think it works many different ways. For the long-term chronic caregiving, there's unique hardnesses for everybody. You know, for men who try to problem solve and get to the right person and maybe get the right supports in place, or try to do all of that, and they get frustrated because the system doesn't support that. And for women who are giving and giving of their emotional selves, and they're depleted, and then they snap because they're so depleted, and then they feel really guilty because they snapped. I shouldn't have snapped because I should be loving and caring. All the words that go with should. Whenever you hear should, my radar just goes off, like, okay, says who? Says who?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a pretty good question, actually, Rose. I haven't really thought about that in terms of, yes, the kind of societal expectations as well, I guess, around that. Yeah. Brilliant.
Hey, Marissa, gotcha on here. This is really nice.
This is the comment more than anything else.
you.
It's so lovely to hear you speak, Darcy. I work in a very different environment. So I work with individuals who are experiencing homelessness here in London, Ontario. Darcy, for the rest of you, Darcy was a professor of mine quite a few years back now. And I always follow, I mean, anything she's doing, I'm always popping in. But hearing her speak and hearing about her approaches with compassion, I deal with the amount of death and non-death losses and the amount of grief that I deal with in this field is very intense. And these individuals are usually also very traumatized. So I've got your book on order. I'm very excited to apply more of this to my work and to really learn more about CFT, because I don't know as much as I want to.
Thank you, Marissa. You raise a really good point in that, CFT and compassion aren't just about individuals. There's structural compassion. There is collective compassion. One of the things that I think is really important is looking at compassionate communities, compassionate societies. The structural issues are often what are causing so many problems for the individuals that, we serve. And I think, I'll ask sometimes when I'm talking to people, and I'll say, which is easier for you, self-compassion, compassion for others, or compassion at that, collective global level? And a lot of people will say it's that global, international governmental level that just, they can't even go there. The political grief, the environmental grief, all of these types of losses, the injustice, racism, the things that are happening now, people are often saying they just feel overwhelmed with that. And yet there is a way of looking at a compassion-based responses to those types of grief and loss as well. Marissa, the work that you're doing is amazing work. And I know that you don't just look at people individually, because I remember you in the classes and stuff, but it's really important to think about compassion much more broadly than as an individual thing that I practice and I engage with just a client. It's who I am. It's the citizen that I am. It's how I want to respond to the things that everybody's flooding about. And how can I constructively, with compassion, respond instead of react?
Yes, absolutely.
And I think, sadly, that is the point I'm going to have to wrap us up on, because I can see Zoom is now telling me I've got less than a minute. Darcy, it's been brilliant. I could probably invite you back for a second half, actually, because I think we could continue this. Thank you so much for being the guest.
Thank you, Chris.
And
thanks, everybody.
Expanding so much on everything. And thank you all for turning up. It's lovely to see you all. And there'll be another book club in July. More details to follow. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks very much for having a listen to this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Details of the July book club will be posted soon on our social media channels, and then the recording will follow shortly afterwards. Hopefully you might be able to join us at the event. If not, hopefully you'll catch it on the episode. Thanks again for listening. Goodbye.